Okay, it's the end of the session. We're here for the roadmap to success for Shadow and Sheba. I'm holding some treats to keep them motivated and interested. I think we have two rescue dogs that both have had some checkered history, and I think the guardians have felt sorry for them. And we want to make sure a rescue dog understands that it's nice and loved. But we also want to help them respect us as leaders, because if they think that they're in a leadership position, well, then they're responsible for us. And that responsibility brings pressure, and that pressure brings stress. And that can cause a lot of dogs to misbehave or develop behavioral problems. And I think that's partially a little bit what's going on with her. Now, Shadow's case, his backstory is he was tethered to a tree or just tethered for a long period of his life. And that's very frustrating for dogs. That's why a lot of cities, it's actually illegal to tether your dog unsupervised for longer than 15 minutes. So basically, as a result of his background and his association with the leash, he is leash aggressive is what we call it. Now, my mentor wrote a book. Her name is Karen London. She co-authored the book. It's called Feisty Fido, Solutions for the Leash Reactive Dog. If you have a dog that has leash aggression, it's a lot of times frustration, sometimes it's fear. And so what we do is basically we teach the dog to look at us through a focus exercise, which is what I call it. Karen calls it a watch exercise, but I have a different command for watch. So basically what we do for the watch is I have a bunch of treats in my hand. I have a handful of them here, one in this hand. I would be sitting normally with the dog sitting in front of me, and I have the treats, my hands in balls of fists on my knees. I wait for the dog. As soon as the dog looks up at me in the face like he is now, I raise it like there's a string between his nose and my nose. So I break the string, I travel down the string, and I say, focus, when it goes into his mouth. Now, when we do this, we want to practice with about probably about 8 to 12 treats with the focus exercise. Everyone in the family should do this with each dog once a day. I mean, primarily with Shadow, because he's the one with the problem. We could do it with either dogs. But the idea is at first it's 1 second, 1 second. Eventually it's 1 second, 2 seconds. And eventually you get up to 1 second, 20 seconds. So we can keep the dog's gaze at us for longer and longer periods of time. Now, we practice this in the house at first when it's quiet like this. There's no noise, there's no distraction, no one's eating. But eventually we want to do it in the house when there are some distractions, because eventually we're going to practice this outside on walks, and there's a lot of distractions outside. Now, when we're first practicing it outside, we should wait until we've gotten to the 20-second delay on the second movement. And the dog doesn't have to look me in the eyes, it just has to look at my face. And I'm not cueing the dog by clicking or making any sounds. I'm waiting for the dog to voluntarily look in my face. That's when I raise the treat. Now, I say the word focus every time the treat goes in its mouth so we can associate a command word and then eventually use that. The next step is when we're out on a walk. Sit, buddy. Sit. Sit. Good job. Such a good-looking guy. So when we're on walks, we're going to practice the focus exercise, but instead of stopping and having the dog look at us, we're just going to be walking. He's going to be on the left side because that's where he normally walks. Every once in a while, between every driveway, we're going to say focus. He's going to look up at us. As soon as he does, we raise the treat. We start going to his mouth while we're walking. Now, we're going to do this when there are no dogs around. We want to get to the point where anytime we say focus, he immediately just looks up and he doesn't think about what else is going on. And when we get to the point where he does that consistently, then we can start delaying that delivery of that second treat for a couple seconds until we can get up to maybe 5 or 10 seconds while we're walking and he's maintaining his focus towards us. Now, we also might want to do a little counter conditioning. Now, counter conditioning is a process where we expose the subject, in this case Shadow, to a stimulus that he's reactive to or fearful of, or whatever the reaction is. Now, in his case, he's only aggressive when he's on the leash. When he's with dogs off leash, he's fine. So what we might want to do is either put him on a leash and either go to a park, or we could try to do it at the house. But my two tests for counter conditioning: can I get the dog to sit, and can I get it to be interested in the treat rather than trying to look around the treat? Now, point of fact, a dog does not have to sit in order to do counter conditioning. I do it because it's one of my ways of indicating I'm getting close to the dog's breaking point because he's having difficulty sitting. If we push too far and the dog lunges or barks or reacts at the other dog, we invalidated the work that we did. So that just in that previous session, in the same session. So what we want to do is we want to be very progressive about this. So if he's only reactive to dogs at 50 feet, we're going to practice the counter conditioning at 50 feet. Now what we're going to do is we're going to hold the treat here, put him into a sit, hold the treat up, the dog's over here, and I can manipulate the dog's movement by wherever I hold the treat, I'm going to make him move. So when I see the dog, we're going to hold the treat. Make sure when you're holding it, you have these 3 fingers down and just these 2 fingers up, kind of like the okay, but down. And you're going to put these fingers under his chin so it's not obstructing his view. So the dog's over here, and now I'm going to let him nibble on it. As the dog's walking, I'm still nibbling on it. And you want to time it, so as soon as the dog is about to walk away, he finishes the treat, or if he still has it, you pull the treat away. So the lesson is, when dogs are approaching me, I get the best treat I've ever had. As soon as the dog leaves, the treat goes away. Can we get some more treats, some more dogs around here? It's kind of what they're looking for. And now we got the dogs playing a little bit, which is fine. I'll go to a knee so I can get a little bit more authority. Slow them down a little bit. Okay. We're going to start petting these dogs with a purpose. And that means that we're going to ask the dog to sit or lay down before we pet it. Whenever possible for Sheba, we're going to try to pet her under her chin. When a dog feels good about itself, his nose is parallel to the ground or tilted upward. We're going to use, and we're going to remind each other, if one of us comes in, careful buddy, you're going to fall. If one of us comes in and we see a member of the family is petting the dog and the dog is standing, we're going to say, paycheck. That person's going to throw their arms up, and they're going to say sit or lay down. And as soon as the dog lays, we pet it and say lay, and then we can turn to the person and say, actually, I asked the dog to sit before he came in the room. He stood up when he heard you coming, and I just continued to pet him, which is allowed. We're also going to use passive training, especially for Sheba. So every time that Sheba comes to us, we're going to pet her and say the word come. And I would do that for both dogs when they sit, when they lie down, when they do any of these things. Now, the other thing that we can do that I'd like the guardians to do is use the 4 escalating consequences to disagree with the dogs. The first thing we do is we hiss. We're doing a second one right there off camera. Second thing we do is we stand up abruptly and we turn to face the dog. Our authority goes whichever direction our hips and shoulders are pointed. So keep pivoting until the dog is stationary. As soon as it's stationary, take a step backwards. Do that right away. You want to hiss or stand up or however you're going to communicate. Anytime you're going to reward or correct your dog, you need to do it within 3 seconds for them to understand why it's coming. So for the first consequence, I hiss once per incident, and I match the intensity of my hiss with the dog's intensity. A level 1 hiss like a to a level 10 hiss, which is like a. Second thing we do is we stand up abruptly, we turn to face the dog, and we keep pivoting until the dog is stationary. As soon as it's stationary, we take a step backwards, a single step, left, right. We pause. The dog's still stationary, then we can sit back down or go back to what we're doing. The third consequence is we're going to march directly at the dog with intent. So we don't stop or slow down when we approach the dog. If the dog is still there, when we get there, we walk through the dog. The dog needs to think, if I'm still here when the human gets here, the human is running me over. Giving and taking territory is a big part of how dogs communicate with each other. So this is a pretty strong move. Now once I once I march at the dog, I'm going to march towards the dog until the dog turns sideways to me or greater. When a dog turns sideways, I'm going to stop immediately. Then I'm going to wait for the dog to be stationary. I go back to the second consequence. I pivot till it's stationary. As soon as it's stationary, then I take a step backwards or I sit down. The fourth consequence is I'm going to put the dog in a leash timeout. Come here, buddy. Let's demonstrate a leash timeout. So when I do a leash timeout, I would do this without pulling. Come here, buddy. I'm going to do it with my knee. I would be stepping on it. Now I'm going to give him just enough room to stand or sit comfortably next to me, but not much else. Now most dogs will throw a temper tantrum when you do this because you're telling them to be defiant. Or you're doing it when they are defiant. Now as soon as the dog is done with the temper tantrum, they will SIT. I would not tell them to SIT. I'm just trying to do this for a visual. Sit. As soon as he sits, the leash now you see is tense. So I would take the foot that's on the leash and I slide it towards the dog to take that tension off of the leash. Dogs will always pull against a tense leash, so we want to be nice and loose. Then usually a minute later, sometimes several minutes later, the dog will LAY. And again, they're SITing or LAYing on their own. I'm not telling them to do that. As soon as they LAY, then I very subtly take my foot off of the leash. They are now free, but they're going to be dragging the leash around. Now they don't realize that they're free. Don't tell them. Let them discover it on their own. Now it's dangerous for a dog to be on the leash unsupervised, so we don't want to let them walk around because they get hung up and injure themselves. If a couple minutes later the dog goes back to being rambunctious, we can step on the leash and reapply the consequence. Or if a couple minutes later the dog has been good, then we've already taken the tension off the leash, we can take our foot off the leash, or excuse me, the dog's walking around, and after it's been nice and calm for a couple minutes, then we can go over and take the leash off, and it's not quid pro quo. So those are the escalating consequences that we're going to use. I'd like to see everybody in the family, like I said, practicing the focus exercise at least once a day with each dog, about 8 to 12 treats each time, and we're going to work up to the point where we're at 20 seconds for that. I'd also like to see us practicing the recall exercise with Sheba. She's a very smart dog. She got it in about 2 or 3 minutes, but she wasn't properly incentivized to come, and that was a problem that the guardians were having. So we're going to start out just in the living room with a very small circle, with everybody's about 10 feet apart. Then next time we do it, we're going to have the circle a little bit bigger, and eventually we're going to have one person in their bedroom, somebody's downstairs. The dog's going to have to go further and further distances to find us. I'd like the guardians to use the escalating consequences to define their personal space. We have an L-shaped couch here in the living room, and the dogs like to kind of shove their way in. So we're not going to allow the dogs to shove their way in. They can only come in there with an invitation. And we're going to, make sure that we establish at least 10 feet boundary when we're eating meals. It's very inappropriate for a dog to be within 7 feet or closer of a dog, a human or a dog that's eating. We're going to incorporate some rules. The dog's not going to be allowed in the furniture for as long as these problems are still going on. They're going to have to sit before we let them in or out of a door. We're going to not allow them to be near us when we're eating. And I'd also like the guardians to practice leashing, especially Shadow up. Well, both of them, since they both get excited, multiple times a day. I'd like to see them leashed up at least 5 times for every 1 time they actually go for a walk. Now, for the leashing process, we're going to practice that as well. We're going to desensitize the dogs. So as we get up and walk towards where the leashes are, as soon as the dog walks in front of us, we turn and go sit back down. We don't say anything. That's the consequence. Eventually, we're going to be able to get all the way to where the cabinet is. So we open the cabinet door. We tell the dog to sit. Once it sits, we pick up the leash and go to attach it. The dog gets up or shows excitement, then I put it back and I go sit back down. Now, if we can do this 5 times for every 1 time we take the dog for a walk, we're going to have the dogs much calmer when going through the leashing process. And this is the problem that a lot of dogs have, is they're so worked up before they leave the house, they get all excited on the walk. So when we go through the door, the dogs are going to, again, be behind us, and the human's going to go through the door first. And we're going to practice the focus exercise on walks without dogs around. We're also going to practice the U-turn, which I went through with the guardians. It's outlined in Karen's book. Let me see. There was something else I wanted to go over. Trying to think what the last thing was. Well, I will probably have to put it in my notes or let the client know directly. But really, they're both good dogs. I think we have some confidence issues. That's one thing that I didn't go over, but I would like to see the guardians teaching, especially Sheba, some new commands. Well, I guess petting with a purpose, we talked a little bit about that. We're going to make sure that the dogs are earning it, and that's going to help them feel better about their self-worth. And also, you can use that to delay gratification. The dog, like if I'm playing fetch with Shadow, I'm going to make him sit, then I throw the ball. If he comes and spits the ball and he's bouncing around, make him sit and settle himself down, and then I'll play the game. My game, my rules sort of scenario. All right, and finding ways to delay gratification, like making Shadow wait for permission before he gets to eat the food that's in the bowl on the floor already. Having to sit at the door before I get to go in or outside. Those things all help. All right, well, this is the roadmap to success for Shadow and Sheba. Remember, everything that you do trains your dog. Only sometimes you mean it. See you soon.